I'd read this book. Had I read this book? I hadn't read this book. He'd read this book. Had he read this book? He hadn't read this book. She'd read this book. Had she read this book? She hadn't read this book. You'd read this book. Had you read this book? You haven't read this book. We'd read this book. Had we read this book? We hadn't read this book. They'd read this book. Had they read this book? They hadn't read this book. I'd sung the song. Had I sung the song? I hadn't sung the song. He'd sung the song. Had he sung the song? He hadn't sung the song. She'd sung the song. Had she sung the song? She hadn't sung the song. You'd sung the song. Had you sung the song? You haven't sung the song. We'd sung the song. Had we sung the song? We hadn't sung the song. They'd sung the song. Had they sung the song? They hadn't sung the song. I'd told the story. Had I told the story? I hadn't told the story. He'd told the story. Hadn't he told the story? He hadn't told the story. She'd told the story. Had she told the story? She hadn't told the story. You'd told the story. Had you told the story? You haven't told the story. We'd told the story. Had we told the story? We hadn't told the story. They'd told the story. Had they told the story? They hadn't told the story. I'd made the cake. Had I made the cake? I hadn't made the cake. He'd made the cake. Had he made the cake? He hadn't made the cake. She'd made the cake. Had she made the cake? She hadn't made the cake. You'd made the cake. Had you made the cake? You haven't made the cake. We'd made the cake. Had we made the cake? We hadn't made the cake. They'd made the cake. Had they made the cake? They hadn't made the cake. I'd stolen the car. Had I stolen the car? I hadn't stolen the car. He'd stolen the car. Had he stolen the car? He hadn't stolen the car. She'd stolen the car. Had she stolen the car? She hadn't stolen the car. You'd stolen the car. Had you stolen the car? You haven't stolen the car. We'd stolen the car. Had we stolen the car? We hadn't stolen the car. They'd stolen the car. Had they stolen the car? They hadn't stolen the car. I'd sent the message. Had I sent the message? I hadn't sent the message. He'd sent the message. Had he sent the message? He hadn't sent the message. She'd sent the message. Had she sent the message? She hadn't sent the message. You'd sent the message. Had you sent the message? You haven't sent the message. We'd sent the message. Had we sent the message? We hadn't sent the message. They'd sent the message. Had they sent the message? They hadn't sent the message. I'd found the reason. Had I found the reason? I hadn't found the reason. He'd found the reason. Had he found the reason? He hadn't found the reason. She'd found the reason. Had she found the reason? She hadn't found the reason. You'd found the reason. Had you found the reason? You haven't found the reason. We'd found the reason. Had we found the reason? We hadn't found the reason. They'd found the reason. Had they found the reason? They hadn't found the reason. I'd cut the vegetables. Had I cut the vegetables? I hadn't cut the vegetables. He'd cut the vegetables. Had he cut the vegetables? He hadn't cut the vegetables. She'd cut the vegetables. Had she cut the vegetables? She hadn't cut the vegetables. You'd cut the vegetables. Had you cut the vegetables? You haven't cut the vegetables. We'd cut the vegetables. Had we cut the vegetables? We hadn't cut the vegetables. They'd cut the vegetables. Had they cut the vegetables? They hadn't cut the vegetables. I'd won the game. Had I won the game? I hadn't won the game. He'd won the game. Had he won the game? He hadn't won the game. She'd won the game. Had she won the game? She hadn't won the game. You'd won the game. Had you won the game? You haven't won the game. We'd won the game. Had we won the game? We hadn't won the game. They'd won the game. Had they won the game? They hadn't won the game. I'd lost the pen. Had I lost the pen? I hadn't lost the pen. He'd lost the pen. Had he lost the pen? He hadn't lost the pen. She'd lost the pen. Had she lost the pen? She hadn't lost the pen. You'd lost the pen. Had you lost the pen? You haven't lost the pen. We'd lost the pen. Had we lost the pen? We hadn't lost the pen. They'd lost the pen. Had they lost the pen? They hadn't lost the pen. I'd heard the news. Had I heard the news? I hadn't heard the news. He'd heard the news. Had he heard the news? He hadn't heard the news. She'd heard the news. Had she heard the news? She hadn't heard the news. You'd heard the news. Had you heard the news? You haven't heard the news. We'd heard the news. Had we heard the news? We hadn't heard the news. They'd heard the news. Had they heard the news? They hadn't heard the news. I'd sold the computer. Had I sold the computer? I hadn't sold the computer. He'd sold the computer. Had he sold the computer? He hadn't sold the computer. She'd sold the computer. Had she sold the computer? She hadn't sold the computer. You'd sold the computer. Had you sold the computer? You haven't sold the computer. We'd sold the computer. Had we sold the computer? We hadn't sold the computer. They'd sold the computer. Had they sold the computer? They hadn't sold the computer. I'd thought about it. Had I thought about it? I hadn't thought about it. He'd thought about it. Had he thought about it? He hadn't thought about it. She'd thought about it. Had she thought about it? She hadn't thought about it. You'd thought about it. Had you thought about it? You haven't thought about it. We'd thought about it. Had we thought about it? We hadn't thought about it. They'd thought about it. Had they thought about it? They hadn't thought about it. I'd paid for it. Had I paid for it? I hadn't paid for it. He'd paid for it. Had he paid for it? He hadn't paid for it. She'd paid for it. Had she paid for it? She hadn't paid for it. You'd paid for it. Had you paid for it? You haven't paid for it. We'd paid for it. Had we paid for it? We hadn't paid for it. They'd paid for it. Had they paid for it? They hadn't paid for it. I'd forgotten the password. Had I forgotten the password? I hadn't forgotten the password. He'd forgotten the password. Had he forgotten the password? He hadn't forgotten the password. She'd forgotten the password. Had she forgotten the password? She hadn't forgotten the password. You'd forgotten the password. Had you forgotten the password? You haven't forgotten the password. We'd forgotten the password. Had we forgotten the password? We hadn't forgotten the password. They'd forgotten the password. Had they forgotten the password? They hadn't forgotten the password. I'd broken it. Had I broken it? I hadn't broken it. He'd broken it. Had he broken it? He hadn't broken it. She'd broken it. Had she broken it? She hadn't broken it. You'd broken it. Had you broken it? You hadn't broken it. We'd broken it. Had we broken it? We hadn't broken it. They'd broken it. Had they broken it? They hadn't broken it. I'd shut the door. Had I shut the door? I hadn't shut the door. He'd shut the door. Had he shut the door? He hadn't shut the door. She'd shut the door. Had she shut the door? She hadn't shut the door. You'd shut the door. Had you shut the door? You hadn't shut the door. We'd shut the door. Had we shut the door? We hadn't shut the door. They'd shut the door. Had they shut the door? They hadn't shut the door. I'd hidden it. Had I hidden it? I hadn't hidden it. He'd hidden it. Had he hidden it? He hadn't hidden it. She'd hidden it. Had she hidden it? She hadn't hidden it. You'd hidden it. Had you hidden it? You haven't hidden it. We'd hidden it. Had we hidden it? We hadn't hidden it. They'd hidden it. Had they hidden it? They hadn't hidden it. I'd written the book. Had I written the book? I hadn't written the book. He'd written the book. Had he written the book? He hadn't written the book. She'd written the book. Had she written the book? She hadn't written the book. You'd written the book. Had you written the book? You hadn't written the book. We'd written the book. Had we written the book? We hadn't written the book. They'd written the book. Had they written the book? They hadn't written the book. I'd eaten sushi. Had I eaten sushi? I hadn't eaten sushi. He'd eaten sushi. Had he eaten sushi? He hadn't eaten sushi. She'd eaten sushi. Had she eaten sushi? She hadn't eaten sushi. You'd eaten sushi. Had you eaten sushi? You hadn't eaten sushi. We'd eaten sushi. Had we eaten sushi? We hadn't eaten sushi. They'd eaten sushi. Had they eaten sushi? They hadn't eaten sushi. I'd done it. Had I done it? I hadn't done it. He'd done it. Had he done it? He hadn't done it. She'd done it. Had she done it? She hadn't done it. You'd done it. Had you done it? You hadn't done it. We'd done it. Had we done it? We hadn't done it. They'd done it. Had they done it? They hadn't done it.